referring to them like they're farmers, but he's literally talking about them, Paul establishing a church and Apollos preaching at the church and trying to expand on the foundation that, or the basis that Paul left. Verses 10 to 15, they talk about the builder. And then 16 to 17, they talk about the temple. And it says, you are a temple of God. It doesn't mean you personally. I mean, you're included, but it's talking about the whole church is considered a temple of God. So anyway, having covered the basics about what a metaphor is and what metaphors are addressed in this lesson, let's take a minute or a few minutes and read the scriptures here. I'm going to go ahead and add the first 4 verses of the chapter as well. So, Ronnie, you mind reading verses 1 through 10? And then Becky, would you mind reading 11 through 17? Thank Okay, thank you. So what was the problem with the Corinthian church? It doesn't really, we're tempted to think that everybody there had a problem, but it wasn't that. He talks about the problems among the church. It could have been half the church, it could have been 25%, it could have been 5%, it could have been 1%, but there was a problem. And that's like churches today. Sometimes we think that, well, there's a few members that are off. They're not doing right or they're not thinking right. But overall, the church is doing okay. Well, actually, if you have any members that aren't doing right, that's a danger to the church. It's something that we don't want to have, we don't want to tolerate. But the main problem was immaturity. He talks about him being fleshly. What do you think fleshly means, Jim?
Well, of course, it's as opposed or compared to the spiritual. And I guess, anybody, of course, before we come to Christ, the flesh, I mean, that would be a simple definition, I guess. But a switch is not flipped entirely. I mean, people, if we're forgiven when we come to Christ, which is, I know what we'll come to Christ. But our whole being doesn't change instantaneously. And so, he starts out by greeting these people as brothers and sisters in Christ. So we
Right.
give him credit for being genuine Christians, and yet he's saying on the spectrum from, 0 to, the end of your life, or whatever, you haven't made a lot of progress yet
Yeah.
as far as spirituality.
And even the best Christian, the most spiritual, has fleshly moments, I guess. But you try to have your more mature moments, spiritual moments, increase and those fleshly moments decrease.
Mark, I still remember, and this is not such a simple metaphor, but I remember a preacher years ago, many years ago, he said, you may see two people on the same day, and they appear to you to be both the same kind of people, because they maybe have both done the same thing that's wrong. But in fact, if you know about these two people, one of them may be on an upward spectrum, so to speak. They're moving from not so good to good, and the other one is on a downward thing, but they just happen to meet that, that.
Right.
And that could well be.
C.S. Lewis, the writer in Mere Christianity, talks about a lady that people basically were like, goodness, she's negative, she's cranky, she's this, she's that. And he basically says, but you didn't know how she used to be. She's way better. She's progressing in the right direction. So even though she's not perfect yet, she's at least heading in the right direction. Some people are just stagnant. And you made a good point a few minutes ago when you said he was addressed to all these people and they were accepted as Christians. That's true. Even these immature Christians, by virtue of accepting Christ and so forth, and trying their best to live well, their salvation will be guaranteed. But as we'll get into a little later, they won't necessarily get as great a reward, but they will have salvation. So, right, but you want to do better than that if you can. Got a few verses here that they're in other chapters, but they kind of reflect on what we're talking about here. Chuck, you mind reading 1 Corinthians 14:20? Yeah, 1 Corinthians 14:20. And Marcy, would you do Ephesians 4:13 to 15? Mona, you mind doing Hebrews 5:12 to 14? And Bill, would you do James 4:1 to 2? We're going to see that this is a theme that's strung all through the New Testament. It's not just this one place that we're addressing today. Okay, Chuck? Okay. Ephesians 4:13 to 15. Hebrews 5:12 through 14.
For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need again for someone to teach you the elementary principles of the actual words of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is uninformed with the word of righteousness, for he lives in income. But solid food is for the mature, who because of practice have their senses trained to distinguish between good and evil.
Okay. And Bill? Okay, so strife and divisions come from evil or fleshly desires, and that results in fighting among people. And these other verses that were read, they emphasize the same thing that was emphasized in these first few verses of chapter 3. You don't want to just stay at the level where you have to have milk type teaching, just real basic teaching. You want to be able to learn and grow spiritually. And in the process, you become a better person, a better Christian. You grow closer to Christ. You do more to please God. You want to make sure that you're growing like that. When he talks about milk teaching, we're like, well, what exactly is milk teaching? If you think in real simple terms, like a child, the things they learn just in everyday life, 2 + 2 = 4. That's milk teaching. It's basic. They get a little older and they learn trigonometry and geometry and algebra and things that are more meat teaching or solid food. From a standpoint of behavior, milk teaching, you tell somebody, don't be influenced by the culture around you. Don't hang around with bad people. And so a kid says, okay, I understand that. I'm supposed to avoid these people. But the solid food teaching is when you teach them that there are ways you can influence and shape the culture around you. So that would be at a higher level. That would help you to do more and to develop your character and so forth, not just know a few basic things that you've been told. So something we need to think about. If Paul was writing a letter directly to each of us individually, would he consider us so fleshly and immature that all he could do is give us milk teaching? Or would he consider that we're ready to receive solid food, solid teaching at a more involved level? And we hope that the longer we're at church, the longer we are a Christian, that we would be ready to receive that more involved teaching. There's today a problem in the church worldwide where I think a lot of people, they're not bad people at all, but they come to church and they listen to sermons every week. Then they go home and they just go about their normal activities like they always have. And they don't really think, what did I learn today that can help me to be a better person, closer to God, more a follower of Christ? Like I say, they're not necessarily out doing anything bad, but they're just kind of, instead of going like this, they're just kind of floating along at a same level there. So after getting past this introduction and that part, he mentions Paul and Apollos. And of course, he used the metaphor of one of them planted, another one watered. And did that really cause the resulting crop, which would be, the crop of course would be the development of people as Christians, their conversion to Christianity and their growth as Christians. And you know, today, just like then, there's a lot of people that tend to give extra credit to the person that first taught them or baptized them, or to their preacher. They talk about preacheritis, where people are so hung up on a particular preacher. And you know, there's nothing in the world wrong with admiring a preacher. You know, I admire Mel and his teaching and his dedication to his job. But if you start thinking that the whole reason for this church is because of this one person, and he gets all the credit, and you don't think about, no, it's really God. When I was first baptized, I went to a church that had about 800 people. When they hired their preacher, they had a couple hundred people. And by the time I left there were 1,500 people. And many, many times you would hear elders get up and talk about, all this church growth is 100% on one person. Because we have such a great preacher is why we have a great church. It's why we have all this growth. And they went on and on and on. Well, he may have done his part to help, but we're told here that God is the one that gives the increase. Sure, you contribute. It helps to plant. It helps to water. But you can't say that you completely did it. And you know, a lot of churches, not necessarily Churches of Christ, but churches all across denominations everywhere, they'll have like maybe yearly reviews of the preacher. Well, how many people did he baptize this year? How much did he grow the church this year? Did he get the contribution up? And they look at those kind of things. And what they should really be looking at is, did he preach the truth? Did he preach the gospel? Did he encourage people to be Christ-like and to follow God? And that should be more of a measure of if somebody is doing their job. Paul and Apollos were prime examples of Christian workers with different gifts who complemented one another and worked together for the common goal of building God's kingdom. They knew that ultimately it was God that built the kingdom, but they helped as best they could and as faithfully as they could. Paul was known for starting many churches during his missionary journeys. In a sense, you think of Paul as the evangelist of these two. Apollos was more the preacher-teacher. Although, you know, Paul obviously taught with his various writings, but they sort of had different, they came at it from different angles. They were both servants focused on doing what was vital and necessary task. Basically, they were tools used by God to accomplish his purpose. So we need to think of it that way. When you take somebody like Mel, yes, he's a very good preacher, but he's actually an instrument of God. God is the craftsman, and Mel is the instrument he uses to reach out and to help lift people up. Kind of interesting, you know, in just everyday terms, we don't focus on the instrument normally. We do that when we're talking about God and preachers and teachers and elders even, whoever. But when we're on everyday life, let's say you're looking at a Da Vinci painting. You don't say, wow, that's a great painting. Let's go and honor that brush. And when somebody is at the Olympic Games and sets a shot put record, we don't say, let's go pin a medal on that ball that he threw. That was just the instrument that he was able to use to accomplish things. And at a Chopin concerto, we don't run up and everybody lift the piano up on your shoulders and say, look what that piano did, isn't that great? I mean, they're essential to getting things done, but the ultimate artist or composer or athlete is the one that deserves the honor. And in the same way, God deserves the honor for any increase, any change in our lives. And the others were instruments used by God. As a matter of fact, the word that is servant here is actually the same word that's a table waiter. And you don't think of the table waiter as getting all that much credit for things. You know, the chef maybe gets a certain amount, but the table waiter, basically, he's a nice guy and all, but he just comes to you, serves you, and goes about his business. And in the same way, the preacher, the elder, the guy who first studied with you and maybe baptized you, they're serving you, but the ultimate transformation is going to be accomplished by God, not by them. And again, not to minimize their contribution, but they can't take, 100% of the credit and say, look what I did. Or other people, shouldn't be lifting it up and saying, oh yes, they're the one that has converted more people than anybody. Because God actually achieves the conversion. You contribute to the conversion, if that makes sense. So how should all this affect our attitude toward other Christians and other Christian workers? Well, we should be unified. We should work together for the same goal and complement each other. How should our attitude be to people that we teach? We need to realize they're not our personal accomplishment. They're not changed by our own willpower. Only God changes them and uses, if we're teaching the right things, God will use it in the right way to influence them. And we need to remember that we don't always see the results of our labors. I was reading a while back, this one missionary was in the missionary field. First year, nobody was converted. Second year, nobody was converted. Fifth year, nobody was converted. Seventh year, 11 people were converted. It took that long. Now, he had to get kind of discouraged and wonder, am I accomplishing anything? But eventually, in God's own time, he was able to accomplish it. So how should our attitude to God be? We need to give him all the glory. We need to become a willing and committed tool in his hands to accomplish his purposes. Now, after talking about the farmer metaphor there for those few verses, he switches to the foundations metaphor, talking about foundations. He mentions it in verse 9, and then verse 10 through 15, he goes into more detail. Well, when we think of foundations, we can think of them in terms of things we can relate to. Buildings have a foundation. We remember, I don't know, time flies so, but a year or two ago, you remember in Florida there was a big apartment building that crashed down because the foundation wasn't 100% properly built. So that tells you the importance of the foundation in holding up the building. And then there was an incident in 1940. Now, I guess Ronnie is probably the only one that remembers it personally. But, yeah, maybe Lester. He was maybe in third or fourth grade then. But Jim and Mona have been out in this area. They've got a child out there in Washington State. Isn't that right? Well, Puget Sound is this big area there, and it's kind of wild. It's got the water's over 200 feet deep, and the water moves at 12.5 feet per second, sweeping through the channel 4 times a day. Well, there's a narrow part of the channel that's a little over a mile wide. And so back in about 1912, they decided that they needed to build a bridge. But it was kind of a big challenge. So finally, the Works Progress Administration decided that it would fund the building of a bridge across that channel. And so in 1938, they were going to build it. And it would be the third largest suspension bridge in the world, after the Golden Gate Bridge and the George Washington Bridge. So they started building it, and they realized that it was going to cost too much. About $220 million in today's dollars. So they decided that maybe we need to do it a little different. So they had some engineers come and redesign it. And instead of having these 25-foot wide supports like the Golden Gate Bridge had and like the George Washington Bridge had, they designed these little 8-foot flat plate things to hold the bridge up. Gray could explain it more. He's built bridges. He's an engineer and an architect, but he's not here to explain it to us. But anyway, the upshot was they decided that they could save money and do the equivalent of about 130 some million instead of the 220 some million. So they built the bridge, and took them 2 years, from 1938 to 1940. And the men that built the bridge called the bridge Galloping Gertie, because the winds would come, and even while it was being built, it would kind of go up and down and shake this way and that way. And they said, that's all right. The people will drive across it and they'll just know that it kind of vibrates. So July 1st of 1940, they opened the bridge. And then on November 7th of 1940, 4 months and 6 days later, there was kind of a big wind came through there, sustained winds of 42 miles an hour. Well, you're not even a hurricane until it's 75 miles an hour, and houses are supposed to be built to withstand at least 110 miles an hour at the base level. Well, this newspaper editor was the only car on the bridge that day. It's hard to even fathom that, because you think of these bridges in areas like that as just being one car after another. But it was early in the morning. He's driving across, and suddenly the bridge starts buckling, and he and his little Cocker Spaniel, Tubby, that was in the back seat. And he got out of the car, and he was trying to get to Tubby, and he couldn't. And, you know, these big concrete and asphalt and metal plates are fluctuating all over the place. So he crawled and skinned his knees and tore his hands up, but he made it to the edge of the bridge. And he was crying about his dog. So this photographer for the local newspaper climbed onto this bridge that's going this way and that way to try and rescue the dog. He couldn't rescue him. This professor went out, tried to rescue the dog. He couldn't rescue him. And he was able to crawl back, and about the time he got back on shore, the bridge collapsed. Just dropped into that 200 feet deep water. And the car and Tubby were just swept out to sea because of that swift moving current, never found again. Apparently he was a valuable little dog, because the government gave the guy $450 for his car, which is a little over $8,000 in today's dollars. And they gave him $364.50 for losing Tubby, and that's a little over $7,000 in today's dollars. But anyway, those are just little extra facts. But the bottom line, there was not a proper foundation for that bridge. Now, they couldn't rebuild it because a month later Pearl Harbor occurred, and so all the building materials went into the war effort. But in 1950, they built a new bridge, and they built it with the right foundation, and to this day it's still standing. They even built a second bridge and turned each one of them into a one-way traffic bridge, and it was built, I think, in 2007. Again, as far as we know, it's got a proper foundation. It's still standing. And then there's another thing about foundations that we all know. Jim is a big reader. Do you remember James Halliwell Phillips? Anybody? Well, he was a famous English writer. He specialized in Shakespeare and antiquities and other things. But his most important work, his most famous work, was a book called The Three Little Pigs. That was based on a German folk tale. Probably everybody's read that. They just didn't know James Halliwell Phillips was the author. It was based on a German folk tale, but he's the first one that actually wrote it out and put it in, published it. And he added, not by the hair of my chinny chin chin, and he added, I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house down. Well, all of you know the first little pig, they all left their mother and went out into the world. The first one built a house made out of straw. The second one built a house made out of sticks. And the third one built a house with a stone foundation and brick walls. And they all, to a certain degree, did like Christians do. They accomplished something. They had a roof over their heads, but the first two were kind of more interested in more worldly things, so they just slapped together something quick, especially the first one. The wolf came along, blew that down. He runs to his brother's house with the sticks. He comes and blows that one down. They run to the other house. And because it had a proper foundation and proper walls that were built upon that foundation, the wolf wasn't able to blow the house down. Now, in our story, who would the wolf be? Satan. I was getting worried there for a second. Yeah. Satan is the wolf. He's trying to tear Christians down. But the Christians that have built a proper foundation that's based on Christ and dedicated to God, based on the teachings of the Bible, and striving to always live more closely to those teachings, they're going to have the kind of foundation that's going to resist that big bad wolf, Satan. And they'll be able to make it through. Now, after talking about the foundation and how important that is to us and how it needs to be based on Christ and only on Christ as a foundation, he then shifts to the last part of the chapter, or the last part that we're addressing. There's more, but the part we're looking at, verses 16 and 17. He says, "Do you not know that you are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you?" And like I mentioned at the very beginning, he's talking about the collective you, the plural you, that the temple of God is the church. It's not this building. It's not any of the buildings. It's all the people. And later he uses similar language to discourage the Corinthian Christians from engaging in immoral behavior. But basically he's comparing the church to the temple of God, and he applies the metaphor to the Christian. And it says here, quoting Wayne Jackson, it says, "A severe warning therefore is given. Any who would destroy via a corrupting process the Lord's church by means of false teaching, a factitious spirit, etc., will receive a just retribution from God himself." So basically, we're being told there that you're the temple of God. You need to preserve that temple. You don't need to do anything that will bring it down, because if you bring it down, ultimately God's going to bring you down. And so there's several things that I think we can learn from this, and I hope we have learned something here. Thank y'all.